Welcome to Salon Talks. I am Mary Elizabeth Williams, and this is acclaimed director, writer, and producer, Julie Cohen. You know her from RBG, from Gabby Gifford's Won't Back Down, from a whole lot of other movies. You've made a lot of movies, Julie, and right now she has a brand new movie coming out. It's an illuminating, incredible film. I learned so much from it. It just premiered at Tribeca. You're going to be able to see it all across the country as well. It is an exploration of the often controversially overlooked I in LGBTQIA+, intersex people. It's called Everybody Welcome. Let's get into this because I learned so much from this movie. I learned so much that I didn't know, and I didn't know truly what it even means to be intersex. Let's start there. Tell me what it means because it's complicated.
Yes, well, let's start at the beginning because part of the importance, but also the challenge of making this film was the level of kind of societal ignorance on this subject. Intersex people are people who have biological, anatomical, and/or chromosome traits that put them not squarely in the male or female box that we're all accustomed to. Just to use some examples from the film, maybe you have XY chromosomes, what would we think of as male chromosomes, but present as externally what we would think a woman is. Maybe it's somebody who has external genitals that are female, but internally, instead of a womb and ovaries, testes. There's actually internal testes. There's a whole range. There are probably somewhere around 40 different conditions that might fall under this broad medical umbrella of intersex.
And it's not about having a both-ism. I think a lot of us grew up with this very outdated word, hermaphrodite, which is not used anymore, and this concept that someone who was intersex was somehow, quote unquote, both.
Right.
And that is not at all.
So, right, there's a logical place where that comes from. The term hermaphrodite is a term in the animal kingdom that you learn about, when you're in biology class. I remember learning about hermaphrodites in animals in junior high school. And that is something that biologically exists in the animal kingdom of certain species that have full reproductive male and female organs and as a result can reproduce without a mate. There are no people like that. And that's why the term hermaphrodite, which up until actually relatively recently, just a few decades ago, was often used to describe intersex people, that's kind of why it's problematic, because it's so misleading.
Right. And this is really common. It's so common. I had no idea. Give me because you presented it in the movie, give me these numbers.
So again, a little bit of a complication. Like the numbers that the United Nations use for intersex most broadly defined, which could mean any intersex traits, is 1.7% of the population. But when you're looking at people whose intersex traits are a bit more pronounced, like those who we feature in the film, people who might be referred for surgery, that gets you to a smaller number. We calculated it at more than 200,000 Americans. So it's still, it's not. This isn't tiny. It's not like a really super rare condition. And the reason that it hasn't been talked about, and the reason that people think of intersex as being so rare and so anomalous, is that those who are born intersex or develop intersex traits, which can also happen, are often subjected to unwanted surgeries and are told to keep secret about it, like that this is something shameful. Or they're not even told themselves. Their parents, would consent to having surgery done on them in infancy or childhood, and then just never really explain. There's all kinds of intersex adults who have some memory of, I know I had some kind of surgery or series of surgeries, or I was told to take hormones as a child. I never exactly understood why. Sometimes they give a long, complex medical term, but the ignorance about being intersex often even applies to intersex people themselves when they're young.
And we can trace this ignorance and these kinds of procedures very clearly, not to only one person, but there definitely is one person who is at the center of the way in which intersex people are classified, treated, or have been for decades. He's at the root of this story as well. Tell me about Dr. John Money.
Yeah, so Dr. John Money was a sexologist at Johns Hopkins University for many decades. He was kind of at the forefront of studying anomalies in gender and actually had some relatively, for the time, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, at the height of his career into the 80s, had actually some fairly prescient thoughts about gay people, about trans people, but he also really took an interest in intersex people, children particularly, and was key in developing this notion that gender is not fixed for the first 2 or 3 years of life. So his theory was that if a child is born intersex, you just pick a gender, turn the child with surgery, hormones, whatever's necessary, into that gender and raise it in that gender. Most likely, most often, what was happening is that intersex children were being raised as girls. I think easy to understand, if a bit glib phrase for understanding this, that is it's easier to dig a hole than build a pole.
Wow.
So for medical reasons, it was easier to turn intersex children into girls when they may or may not, as they grew, understood themselves to be girls. And Dr. Money, as we get into in the film with some pretty extraordinary archival footage that we have of him, basically set out to prove this notion that a child's gender is malleable by taking a young boy who had his penis severely injured in a botched circumcision and moving towards surgery and a program of counseling to turn this 100% biological boy into a girl, with the thought that it would be better to be raised as a girl, even if you're a boy, than to be a boy without a penis.
And the story of David Reimer it comes maybe about midway through the movie,
right.
and it really, and then the movie kind of slows down so you can get his story. And it is absolutely heartbreaking. He was not born intersex. He was made into something he never signed up for without his consent, in many ways without his family understanding.
Right.
Tell me about what happened to him, because it's truly a tragedy.
Yes, so as I say, injured in a botched circumcision, at around a year old, surgery was performed to entirely remove his penis, to castrate him, and he was told that he was a girl. His parents actually moved to another town for a while so that nobody would remember. And I should mention, and the reason that Dr. Money was so fascinated with his case, David was an identical twin. He had a twin brother named Brian. So the idea was, this will be a perfect test case. We're going to raise this boy as a girl, give the boy toys, make David, whose name they had changed to Brenda, make him wear dresses, give him girls' toys to play with, tell everyone he was a girl. He never felt comfortable being a girl because he understood him, even though he didn't know his medical history, he understood himself to be the boy that he was. By the time he was a teenager, his parents told him the truth. He decided to go back to living as a boy. He ultimately had reconstruction of his penis. Hadn't been available when he was a baby in the 60s, but later in life it was possible. So he began living as a male. He actually got married, adopted the children of his wife, but his case spread. Dr. Money was spreading his case through medical records and medical journals as a huge success because because David was anonymous, because the case, nobody was named, there was really no way for people to check up when Dr. Money's writing these reports like, oh, this is great, we raised a boy as a girl, he was happy as a clam. Now, at a certain point, Dr. Money did stop writing. Dr. Money didn't keep talking about it, but he didn't retract what he had written.
And the impact of this then plays out in these three extraordinary people that you focus on in this film. Very different intersex individuals who really represent different sides of the story, but one thing they all have in common is how their lives were impacted by these kinds of policies, these kinds of procedures. Tell me about the three people at the heart of this story who are amazing activists who are really changing the conversation.
Absolutely. So these are three people who all in some ways are the legacy of Dr. Money, in that because they were born intersex, the program for them was surgery that in their three cases was not medically necessary, and secrecy. They did not understand fully their own conditions, and they were told to be quiet about them. The amazing thing about these three relatively young people in their 30s and 40s now is how they've come through this, how with the help of the internet, frankly, where they started to learn that there were other people like them and that they weren't some anomalous freak, but actually part of a substantial group of people who have intersex conditions. They decided they were going to dispense with this whole idea of keeping their bodies a secret, talk about what had happened to them as a way to prevent it from happening to other people later, and as a way to just shed the shame. And all three of them are tremendously engaging, very successful people, each in their own way. River, who identifies as non-binary now, is an actor in Los Angeles. Alicia, who was raised as a girl and identifies as a woman, is a writer. She's just finishing a book called Inverse Cowgirl about her intersex life, but also
so much.
but also a political activist and incredibly involved in her community in Texas, of all places, of fighting for the rights of LGBTQIA people. And then Saifa, who is a PhD student now. He's from the Bronx, but now lives in northern England. Saifa, in a sort of similar situation to David Reimer, Saifa was born ambiguous. Looking on his childhood medical records, as we do in the film, you see that the doctors checked a box that said ambiguous, and then they crossed it off. They wrote female because his genitals were somewhere in between. And they basically, he said he would say to his mom all the time, but I'm a boy. And his mom would say, no, you're a girl, because that's kind of what she had been told by the doctors that she should do. And it wasn't until he was in college that he discovered what intersex people were. He understood, oh, wait a second, that's me. Now I kind of get my life, and I'm gonna live as the boy, the man, that I am. And for people that have been through a lot of trauma, as you saw, if you saw the film, like these are like really upbeat, enthusiastic, hugely intelligent, and sort of like inspiringly humorous and often joyous people. And I think I think they're all a little bit sick of feeling like they're supposed to feel steeped in trauma. They've decided to come sort of as out and proud intersex people, very much inspired by the gay rights movement, by the trans movement. And so kind of watching them fighting the fights that they're fighting and starting to form a community with other intersex people is a lot of what the film is about.
And let's talk about the ways in which, to coin a phrase, these communities do intersect, because I was also shocked watching this movie to learn that the kinds of procedures and therapies that are being fought against to help trans kids are being imposed involuntarily upon intersex kids. It's it's an argument that doesn't even make sense. The amount of ignorance that is going on in this country right now regarding how to treat people medically is astonishing. Talk to me a little bit about what this looks like medically, because I learned this is happening at my hospital in New York City, in a world-class facility. These kinds of procedures are being done on kids against their will. What does that look like, and what does it look like in the ways in which our understanding of gender is informed by the trans movement, is informed by the LGBTQ movement in general?
Yes, there's a lot. There's a lot in there. So let me. I just want to make an interesting point. Like this, the surgeries aren't exactly being done against these. Often these surgeries are being done on babies and children who don't have much of an opinion one way or the other. Their parents are consenting to the surgery, often based on not clear understanding, but very much with the best interest of children at heart, and even to have some, to take in the perspective of doctors. Sometimes just have maybe, to me, what feels like an outdated notion now that like, said that the particular surgery we talk about in the film, being done here in New York is for a particular condition where sometimes a child basically would be a girl with a very large clitoris, large enough that it would appear externally, quote unquote, abnormal. And the assumption has been like, oh, well, you'd rather look normal, right? A girl wants to look like other girls, doesn't she? So the thought is like, if we just take care of this whole situation early in the baby's life, and then she'll never have to know about it, and she will be spared the trauma of feeling like a weirdo. Like that's the idea. So I just want to
Sure, and listen, I'm a mom. If someone had said to me when my child was an infant, there is a problem and we can fix it,
exactly,
or we will fix it, which is what a lot of these parents were told.
Right.
I understand, like I get that completely. The way in which this conversation has gone for decades has been, this is a problem. It's a medical problem in the same way that if your child was born with something quote unquote wrong with their heart or with their eyes, you would fix it and you would intervene early.
Right.
But.
So now I do want to get back to your very good analogy and interesting contrast with laws being imposed now on trans children and teens. A lot of states in this country are raising and in many cases passing laws that can penalize doctors and even parents for trans-affirming care, for gender-affirming care for trans people. Mainly they're talking about giving hormones, because that's puberty blocking hormones is something that's happening sometimes for trans young people going into puberty. There's a lot of talk about surgery, but for the most part, surgeries aren't done on trans children. That would happen after the child reaches 18 or older. But there's a lot of talk about, stopping surgeries. Even in a lot of these cases, the laws are saying like no psychological care that affirms the kid's gender, which is really troubling considering we know about the high rates of suicide for trans kids and teens. The incredible part where intersex people come into this conversation is the vast majority of those laws, those bills that are being debated, have these little provisions to them that say like, but for intersex kids, and they rather than using the word intersex, often they list a whole series of medical conditions that could count as intersex. They say, but for intersex kids, basically like, knock yourself out, do whatever kind of surgery you feel is necessary. Alicia, one of the participants in our film, makes the really strong point that the reasoning is kind of like that the legislators bringing up these laws are saying like, well, trans kids aren't normal, so we need to not let them be trans. And intersex kids also aren't normal, so we have to like basically stuff them into the male and female box so that everyone can feel like, oh, it's normal, it's fine, it's all the gender expectations that we've all been given and have lived with for, you know, since the beginning of time, about what a girl is supposed to be and what a boy is supposed to be. Boxes, by the way, that don't work out so well for many men and women, regardless of whether they're trans or intersex or not.
Absolutely. And this is not just a battle that is being fought in the legal system. This is also something that we are very much seeing in the media. I want to talk about that because these misconceptions and truly dangerous information about gender in general and gender identity are being peddled by people like Tucker Carlson, by people like Stephen Crowder. There's a wonderful moment in the film where Alicia gets into a very articulate debate with him. Tell me about how these people are perpetuating these really dangerous and completely medically misinformed ideologies about gender.
Well, you know, I think there's just a lot of fear about anything that isn't like, that doesn't fit expectations. Like, I actually think that's become such an issue in all kinds of contexts having to do particularly with gender and with race and with sexual orientation. There's just like people want things to be very clear and very, so when things feel like they're a little blurry, then I don't know, everyone like freaks out. As far as you know, there's this thought that like sort of the trans people are like coming to get your children, which, you know, I don't really quite know what to say about that, but it's an argument that has kind of caught on the political right in recent years, in the same way that a very similar argument having to do with gay adults was a factor going back to around the 80s. I mean, I remember it from my childhood, the thought of like, you know, there's going to be gay teachers in your school turning your child gay. So now there's talk about trans. When, as far as the intersex part of this, I think the biggest complaint and concern of the intersex people that are in my film and that I've come to know over the past couple of years is that they're sort of ignored entirely to the point of being invisible. I can sort of now confirm that, having, you know, we've put the trailer for our film out into the world, and while there's so much support and love and admiration for people kind of coming forward and telling their stories and speaking their truth, there is a minority opinion of people whose basic comments on social media towards the participants in the film are either like, I hate you and you just should be quiet. That's one thing. But another thing is like, I don't believe you. I don't believe you exist. And actually, like, that's actually not a tenable position. No, there are intersex people. Like, it's not like to say like I don't think they exist just doesn't make sense. But I'll look on TikTok. People are saying it.
And when and when we get back to that number that we talked about earlier, you know, 1.7, like roughly almost 2% of the population. That's the same percent of the population that are identical twins. That's the same percent of the population that are born with red hair. Like if you think intersex people don't exist, it's like saying you don't believe that redheads exist. You don't believe that identical twins exist. Like it's the same sort of mentality. Julie, I want to ask you, what brought you to this story? You're obviously so passionate about it. You're obviously have such a deep caring and protectiveness of this community and such love for the people who you've profiled in this story. What is it that brought you to this?
Yeah, well, I'll say, starting with the later part that you said, I mean, I was really drawn to this and gravitated to this story because of just an admiration for the power that people can have by standing up for their own rights that I think just resonated with me and reminded me of other earlier activist movements, whether you're talking gay and trans rights or civil rights or the feminist movement. Like there's always a period of like you've been boxed down and you've been told you shouldn't be speaking up, and like the power of people speaking up always really moves me. What brought me to the story specifically was a bit roundabout. About 5 years ago, my friends at NBC News, where I used to work, asked me to come back and look through their archives for stories that might make good jumping off points for documentaries. I immediately gravitated to the David Reimer Dr. Money story and was just looking into what the modern day relevance was, and it became quite clear, first of all, that this case, even though it was completely debunked, had an impact that still lasts to this day on how intersex people were treated. That led me to looking into the intersex rights movement, and I just actually couldn't believe what a fascinating and blossoming movement this was, considering how little attention it's gotten.
And as you say, joyful, which is a wonderful element of the film and a really important element of the story. And it is a movement that, even though it is a small percentage of the population, we can all participate in and be allies for, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no reason. I mean, I think that's been true in so many movements. I mean, it takes the support of the larger community for a smaller percentage people who've struggled with something and are fighting for their own rights, like their success, like our success is actually all interconnected, I think. So trying to stand up for others, or in this case, just kind of a lot of what intersex people have told me that they want is just for people to explain what intersex is. They're kind of tired of explaining their own bodies. Saifo, one of the participants in the film, just said this to me the other day, like, I'm tired of doing Intersex 101. Like, I want some non-intersex people doing that for us so that we can live our lives and fight for what we want to do without having to explain every single thing about your own genitals.
And another way people can learn and get involved is by watching this movie. It's out right now all across the country.
That's right. June 30th, Focus features Everybody in a theater near you.
Thank you, Julie, so much for joining us.